Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to have you joining us today for what I hope will be just the start of a continued engagement on supporting accommodations for inclusive workplaces. My name is Anne-Marie Finnan, and I am the director of the Work Learn Institute here at the University of Waterloo. If you've joined us for any of the Future Ready Workforce Series events this year, you will know that our focus has been on building inclusive workplaces, and our webinar today follows in this series. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we begin. Closed captioning and live transcription have both been enabled for this session. So to use these features, click on the Show Captions button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Second, we'll also be hosting a Q&A following our presentation. If you have any questions as we go through the presentations, please feel free to write them in the Q&A window, which can be opened by selecting Q&A from the bottom of your Zoom window. We're going to start today's session with our territorial acknowledgement. The University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. At the University of Waterloo, our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is coordinated within the Office of Indigenous Relations. Next, just a little bit about Waterloo. Many of you are quite familiar with us and our programs, and this slide just highlights a few features of what make our university unique. The University of Waterloo was the first post-secondary institution in Canada to offer the cooperative education model. We're now #1 in Canada for experiential learning, and we run the world's largest co-op program of its kind, with over 26,000 students who participate in a global network of over 8,000 employers, with over 8,000 employers. And of course, the University of Waterloo is home to the Work Learn Institute. So at the Work Learn Institute, we study work integrated learning, figure out how to make it work better for all of the participants, for students, for higher education institutions, and for employers. And we're committed to sharing our research-informed insights through venues like the Future Ready Workforce Series. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our 2 guest speakers for today's event. We're absolutely delighted to have with us Carolina Corral, who is the Global Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Manager at Connexus. And she's going to share a little bit about Connexus's journey towards increasing accessibility and the great work that they're doing both for students and full-time employees. And we're also delighted to have our own Mitch Buick with us. So Mitch is our co-op student experience manager for accessibility, and he's going to share a little bit more about the work that he does here at Waterloo to support students with disabilities in their co-op experiences. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. Okay, so here's a high-level overview of our agenda for today. I'm going to start by sharing a few research-informed insights about the experiences of students with disabilities in work-integrated learning experiences like co-op work terms. Then I'm going to pass things over to Carolina, who's going to talk about how Connexus supports accommodations and accessibility. Then we'll turn things over to Mitch, who will share his work in this space. So together with the research, employer, and higher education perspectives, I'm positive that you're going to leave today's session with some actionable strategies to increase accessibility and enhance experiences for work-integrated learning students with disabilities. As we often do, we're going to start today's webinar with a few definitions. And before I get into the definitions, I just want to acknowledge that there are many definitions and that they are constantly evolving in this space as we all continue on a journey of inclusivity. So The definitions that I'm presenting to you today are to give us all a baseline, but I recognize that you might use different definitions and that you might have different understandings. And I also know that some of you might have a lot of expertise in this area, much more than I do. And so I would love for this to be a discussion for us, and I encourage you to share your perspectives and your expertise in the chat as we go through the webinar today. If you've got great resources for your colleagues, please go ahead and add them into the chat. So the definition of disability that we're using today comes to us from the Ontario Human Rights Code. A disability is a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movements, senses, or activities. And this specific statistic that I'm presenting to you today comes to us from StatsCan, that 27% of Canadians have at least one disability. We also want to spend a little bit of time talking about accessibility. So while the title webinar is about accommodations, we need to highlight that there are so many actions that we as organizations can and must take to increase the accessibility of our workplaces. So workplace accessibility refers to creating an environment that accommodates and welcomes employees with diverse needs, including those with physical, sensory, cognitive, or other disabilities. And we note and we advocate that by increasing accessibility for persons with disability, we are increasing accessibility for all workers, and that this is a critical area of exploration and action for all workplace organizations. But we also are here today to talk about accommodations. Our definition of accommodations comes from the Canadian Association for Supported Employment and defines a workplace accommodation as any change in the work environment or the terms and conditions of employment that allow a person with limitations in their abilities or who faces barriers from the standard rules and conditions of work to perform their job. I'd like to shift now to some specific insights on the experiences of students with disabilities in work-integrated learning programs, such as their co-op work terms at Waterloo. We know that students with disabilities are less likely to complete work-integrated learning programs, and that when they do, they are more likely to experience barriers. To help bring these numbers to life, I just want to share a few data points from our colleagues at the University of Guelph who have done some fantastic research in this space. So in one particular study, only 23% of the students that had registered with disability services had completed any kind of work-integrated learning. And when asked about the reasons for not participating in WIL, up to half of those students indicated that their disability influenced their decision to not pursue a work-integrated learning experience. So we're seeing great underrepresentation of students with disabilities in these WIL experiences. Just to help bring that to light with one specific example, this study also found that students with a specific learning disability were almost 10 times less likely to participate in a co-op program. And when those students do elect to participate in co-op programs, they often complete those work terms without accommodations. So this study showed that 80 to 90% of co-op students did not request an accommodation during their work term. I don't know about you, but this was quite a shocking number for me when I first saw it. As we'll talk about over the next few slides, for those with non-apparent disabilities, disclosing that disability is a choice and is often a very, very difficult one for students to make. Students want to work without disclosing their disability. Students will want to work without accommodations, and that is their right. But this number strikes me as far too high to represent choice only, particularly because these students were registered with disability services within their institution. And so I think it really highlights a gap that we have and some opportunities that we have to increase accessibility and to make it easier for students who do want and need accommodations in their work integrated learning experiences to obtain them. So here at Waterloo, we also wanted to better understand the experiences and the barriers faced by our students from equity deserving groups. And so we've conducted a number of studies over the past few years. If you've joined in this year, you would have heard some of the details of those. But over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to walk you through some specific findings related to students with disabilities from those studies. As I'm talking, we'll also share some links to our research in the chat so you can read more if you're interested. But broadly speaking, students with disabilities identified three primary barriers towards inclusive work experiences. So first, as mentioned, for those with non-apparent disabilities, many struggled with the question of whether or not they should disclose their disability, and if so, when they should do so. Second was students identifying a lack of inclusivity in the recruitment process, whether that was an unclear job description, an inaccessible interview process, and challenges with onboarding. And third, students identified challenges with overall inclusivity in their work terms, including getting support for needed accommodations and an overall lack of training and understanding of what it means to have an accessible workplace and to provide accommodations. I'm going to try to bring these barriers to life for you over the next couple of slides by highlighting a couple of quotes directly from our participants in the research studies. So first, I just want to bring the challenge of disclosure into the spotlight. As I've mentioned already, there's lots of reasons why students and all persons with disabilities struggle with the question of whether or not they should disclose. And in our study, we saw two main motivations for concealing a disability. So first, students expressed concerns about losing access to co-op opportunities, and that's highlighted in this first quote. It's hard to disclose because some places claim they want diversity, but I worry that they might not hire me due to my disability. Second, even after they secured that position, many weren't comfortable disclosing because of the stigmatization that they face in their day-to-day life and had experienced up until this point. So as one student noted, I don't tell my employer, oh, I have ADHD, because there's a lot of preconceptions about people with ADHD, how they work, how they behave. So it's just safer not to, because there's a lot of stereotyping still. And while we acknowledge that disclosing is a personal choice, we did hear so many stories of the challenges that were experienced by students when they didn't feel comfortable sharing their disability. So among these, two stood out as particularly prevalent. First, we saw that in masking or hiding their identity, students didn't feel as though they were building authentic relationships with their coworkers or with their managers. And this is a really big problem because lots and lots of research has shown that this sense of connection to coworkers is critically important for a number of outcomes related to co-op work terms, from how much the students learn on the job, to how satisfied they are to the work, to how likely they are to come back to your organization after they graduate. And unfortunately, but not unexpectedly, we heard lots of stories of the stresses and the negative impacts on well-being that resulted from students constantly feeling like they had to conceal their identity. So what can we do for students who do want to disclose but are not sure if it's safe to do so? I'm going to move into a couple of top tips coming from the research now. So as I've already mentioned, one of the biggest barriers identified by our students involves the very first step in the employment relationship, the job description. Students mentioned that many job descriptions didn't include a statement of inclusivity, let alone mention any available supports. And for co-op students who are scanning through hundreds of job postings, this lack of information can be the critical decision point when they self-select out of applying for your position. And I think that this student quote up here really helps to bring this concept to life. I'm lucky that I do want to work for the government, so at least that's where there tends to be more accommodations. But pretty much now, I might as well just look at government jobs and not even consider like private organizations. So I feel that this limits my learning because I can't even seek out those opportunities. Now, I know that so many of you do have inclusive and supportive workplaces, and that you have some fantastic programs in place to support students. And so my number one request to you from this webinar is to go back to your organization and look at your co-op job descriptions, and to make sure that your commitment to inclusivity is identified in that job description, along with any supports that you have in place and programs that you can highlight, so the students understand that that commitment is authentic. In all honesty, when we were preparing for this webinar, we realized our co-op job description didn't include these components. And so it is our commitment to make sure that that is updated before we post a job again. And I hope that you'll join me in that. We've got lots of other tips on creating an inclusive job description, and we will include those in some additional resources that we pass along after the webinar. The next area of focus for the recruitment process is interviews. So once again, there's all sorts of tips and easy to implement strategies to increase the inclusivity of your interview practices. I want to highlight two that really emerged from our research. So first, as highlighted by the following quote, it can be really helpful, particularly for students with disabilities, just to share some details about the interview format to help them understand what to expect. And I want to read this one to you so you can understand what the student's experience was. This is just a small snippet from a much longer quote. I think that if an interview is going to involve any sort of technical questions, like that should be something that's fully outlined before. Not necessarily the exact questions, just more guidelines and structure on what they can do to me in their interview. This one really, really resonated with me, and it was very clear that the student had a lot of anxiety going into interviews, and that it is one small step towards creating accessibility and inclusivity is to give a little bit more information to the student about what that interview is going to look like. Similarly, if you do have accommodation practices for your interview that are available to students, highlight those, identify them, and provide a clear contact for the student to be able to access those accommodations as part of the recruitment process. My last couple of tips for you are going to relate to the onboarding process, which was another area identified by our students. And the challenge really comes down to not understanding the process for requesting accommodations. And this next quote is a simple one that reminds us that students are not only new to your specific workplace, but often new to the world of work. I just don't know who to go to about accommodation. I don't know if it's HR, and nobody really told me who I would talk to get accommodation. So our top tips for inclusive onboarding are to be really explicit about the process of accommodation and the ways in which you embrace accessibility, but to do so at multiple stages in the onboarding process. So a few simple strategies. One, once you've decided what students you're going to hire, send them all a welcome email with details about the first day of work and who they're going to be reporting to. And one of the items you can include in that welcome email is details about the accommodation process. Second, make sure that when you're going through your onboarding activities, you really identify what flexibility exists within your workplace. Again, universal design, a practice that helps all of the students, but that is particularly beneficial for students with disabilities. And make sure that the process and the steps for requesting accommodation are made really clear to the students in that onboarding process. To wrap, I just want to really reinforce the important opportunity that we all have to break cycles of underemployment and unemployment for persons with disabilities through work-integrated learning. In Canada, persons with disabilities are twice as likely to be unemployed as those without disabilities, and this is at every stage of their career and the employment process. But previous research has shown us that successful post-graduation employment is really contingent on positive educational and positive previous work experiences. And there was a big study that was just done in Australia lately that showed that successful work integrated learning experiences, especially those like co-op and internships that are workplace-based, are particularly effective for improving post-graduation employment rates for persons with disabilities. So this is really our opportunity to think about some small actions that we can take today that can have a significant and lasting impact on the lives of our fellow Canadians throughout their careers. So with that, I'm going to pass things off to Carolina to share about Connexus's work in accessibility and accommodations.
Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you, Anne-Marie. I'm a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager at Connexus, and our organization helps people with our software to unlock the full potential of global supply chains. We were founded in Ottawa a very long time ago in 1984, but we now have over 1,800 employees worldwide. And we hire interns in Canada, US, India, Japan, and few countries in Europe as well. We have been recognized as Canada's top 100 employers for young people, and also as a top 100 internship program. And we are currently working on filling over 100 internship positions for winter 2025, and we expect similar numbers as well for summer and fall next year. So we are very busy hiring students around here. And the topic of this webinar is very relevant and very timely because one of our goals for this year at Connexus is to unlock employee potential through accessibility. And at Connexus, we believe, and also research has shown that investing in accessibility is not just a legal duty in most places around the world, but it also improves performance, productivity, employee retention, and it really helps you increase your talent pool, which I think even in today's market, it's still a challenge for many organizations to hire and recruit people. Also at Connexus, we believe that people matter, and it's one of our guiding principles in everything we do. And investing in accessibility really helps us make this belief a reality for more of our employees. And we started our accessibility journey with designing a strategy, and it was actually just this year, so it's still fairly new to us. But I think that this strategy is really foundational, and I think many elements of it are very achievable to a lot of organizations of any size and also with limited resources. And next, I will go over each of these elements in more detail, starting with training and then candidate experience, employee experience, and some metrics. So let's start with training. And with a quote from Stella Young, who was an activist and a person with a disability. If you haven't heard of her, I recommend that you look her up. She once said, "My disability exists not because I use a wheelchair, but because the broader environment isn't accessible." And I really love this quote because it showcases very well the shift from focusing on people with disabilities and their limitations to the environment and its barriers. And it's exactly the mindset that we would like our employees to have. So one of our first steps at Connexus was to increase awareness among all of our workforce and also some functional groups with higher impact on employee experience. And we want our employees to be aware of barriers that exist, also know how they can minimize them as individuals, versus feel sorry for people with disabilities. And we started with educating our workforce, entire workforce, on how to best support colleagues with disabilities and also neurodivergence in the workforce. And interestingly, not every person who is neurodivergent identifies as having a disability. We also offered an educational session to our HR team on creating accessible content. And we are now working on guidelines for the entire organization on the same. And you may think that educating employees on creating accessible content maybe is not the highest impact initiative, because likely not that many employees within your organization are content creators, but we really all are. We all send emails every day. We all create PowerPoints. We all create Word documents, and it's all content that our colleagues, including those with disabilities and employees that we serve, access on a daily basis. We also educated our talent acquisition team on accessible hiring process and how to recognize and provide accommodations. And as Anne-Marie said earlier, it's very uncomfortable and very difficult to disclose a disability for many people to a potential employer. And it often doesn't come as a direct request during the interview process. And finally, we offered sessions to our people leaders on neuro-inclusive management practices, and we will be sharing with them more information next year about accommodations and hiring. Next, let's talk about the hiring process. You know already, we spent a lot of time on that at Kinaxis and trained our talent acquisition team on providing accommodations. But ideally, instead of providing accommodations, we should try to mitigate them by designing inclusive processes. Because if you think about it, if our environment was truly inclusive and accessible for all people, there would be no need for accommodations. We just wouldn't need them. So this year, we reviewed our own process and found opportunities for improvement within the 4 steps that you can see on the screen. For example, we make it very clear in our job descriptions that accommodations are available and how to request them, but not only job descriptions. It's really important to communicate it at every stage of the process. And to make it easy and consistent for us, we added this information to every email template that goes out to candidates from our system. Also, Anne-Marie mentioned before, providing information on the format and tools that will be used in the interview, so candidates know exactly what to expect, and they know if they may need an accommodation or not. It's just easier for them to anticipate if they know what the interview process looks like. And then interacting with people with disabilities during the interview is also very critical. For example, if someone brings a service animal to an interview, does your interview team know what to do? Or do they know why it's important for interviewers to have their camera on during the interview if it's virtual? And we will be sharing more about best practices for each of these steps as part of resources after the webinar. Next, we focused on onboarding. So once our candidates are hired, we want to make sure they are all set up for success, regardless of having a disability or not. And we redesigned our onboarding process this year. And to do so, we consulted, first of all, with an external partner that specializes in this area, but most importantly, with one of our employee resource groups. And it's so critical to always consult with a group that we are trying to benefit with our actions. And in our case, we had our own real employees who gave us feedback on our own process. And honestly, there's nothing more relevant than that. No research can give you what your own employees can tell you about your own process. And some improvements that we made included the employee checklist, and it provides new hires with a list of activities to help them navigate through their first few months at Kinaxis. And it's actually uploaded to our pre-arrival portal, so they know what to expect before they start. We now also have a new hire roadmap, and it's a visual representation of new hires' journey throughout the first year at Kinaxis. And we also host orientation sessions. And it's important because it allows us to have multiple avenues of sharing information. So we have a lot of written documents that can be accessed online, but those sessions are verbal and they are more interactive. And we also have a manager checklist, and it mirrors the employee checklist. So it ensures that both managers and employees are on the same page. They know what they are accountable for, and they know what their roles are. So we made all of those changes to our process, and a lot of organizations make even more systemic changes. But unfortunately, it's often not enough, and barriers still exist. And as we already said a few times, it can be so extremely difficult to disclose a disability and so embarrassing and personal and private. So something that we are working on this year is providing our employees with a list of adjustments that they can make to their own work environment without going through a formal process of disclosure. And I think it's especially important for those newer to the workforce, so recent graduates, students. It's so important for them to know what they can do, and we want to empower them, and we want to make those unwritten rules written. And it's not only important for those newer to the workforce, but also people with disabilities, because a lot of people with disabilities don't know those unwritten rules, and they have to be explicitly written for them so they can navigate the organization better. For example, we want our employees to know that it's okay and they can request noise-canceling headphones if they need them, or that it's okay to take frequent breaks if this is what they need to maintain their focus, or it's okay to block their calendar or request information in writing before the meeting, or even contribute to the meeting in writing via the chat function versus verbally. And if it's not enough, we, of course, have a formal accommodation process in place that is meant for more formal changes to work environment. But a lot of accommodations are really simple and they don't cost anything. There are plenty of metrics that organizations can track to understand success of their accessibility initiatives, but I find 3 of them the most insightful at this stage of our journey, and also simply available to us at this point. The first one is training completion rate. So how many people within our organization now have this increased level of awareness? And also, what is their feedback on the content of our courses? The second one is candidate success rate. We do ask candidates throughout our application process if they have a disability or not, or if they are neurodivergent or not. And then we compare if candidates with disabilities are as successful throughout the process as candidates without disabilities. And the third one is employee experience, and this is my favorite. We conduct an employee experience survey every year, and we also ask our employees those demographic questions. And then we compare experiences of employees with disabilities to those without to see if they are similar or if there are any key differences. And we do it actually for many historically marginalized groups. And I honestly have to tell you, every single year, we find very insightful findings, and then we base our goals on those insights. And this includes all of our initiatives for this year to improve accessibility as well. Thank you so much. I'm happy to connect with any of you later if you have any questions. And now I will pass it on to Mitch.
Amazing. And I think what really excites me are the opportunities that post-secondary institutions have in really creating a positive impact in accessibility in the co-op space. Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled today to be speaking as a representative of the University of Waterloo's Cooperative and Experiential Education Department, really around how higher education can support accessible co-op experiences. I'm mindful that I only have 15 minutes to try to do that. So what I'm going to do is outline a little bit about my role, how it has evolved, and some of the work that we've done in this space already, and a little bit about the aspirations for where we want to go. And so as I go through this content, a key element will really be thinking about how we can best position ourselves to make the biggest impact. Co-op is in a really unique position. We really can bring the academic and employment worlds together, right? So there's complexity with this, but there's also a lot of amazing opportunities when we think about our ability to understand the learner, the curriculum, what are the students bringing, right? And then combining it with our ability to really stay attuned with the needs of our employers, the industry trends, the desired skills. And so this really reflects a big responsibility to be able to bring that together in an effective way, but one that is also accessible for everyone. And so my role is really focused on understanding the co-op experience for students with disabilities. It reflects a new kind of dedication to this work as a reflection of this as a new role. And so the role itself is really looking at supporting the growth towards a more disability inclusive model of co-op. And while we place the students at the center of what we do, and in my job title, we also know that the co-op life cycle spans across many different areas, involves many different people and opportunities for where accessibility can be experienced positively or not. And so what we see and understand is just how interconnected that co-op process is and the need to really value our community's position in this. And so I really do hope that whether you're an employer, a university staff member, or a student in attendance today, you'll really be able to appreciate kind of the collective roles in supporting an accessible co-op experience together. And so going a little bit further, I would really, break down my role as kind of understood through two main areas. And these areas also depict a little bit of the evolution of how this role has shifted in its priorities. So first area is really looking at, I say, continuing to support and optimize the experience with managing day-to-day accessibility topics and employment accommodation requests. Now, I say this is a little bit more reactive element of the role because we do need to make sure that our avenues and pathways for students to request more consultative support or anything in response to questions or barriers or even accommodation matters, we need to make sure that those pathways are accessible. And so this will always be important and needed, but it is a little bit more limited in its scope to be able to go as far as removing the barriers themselves. And so this was a considerable part of the initial focus of the role, and I'll share a little bit about what that has meant in this space. The other area is really looking at kind of outlining more longer term, more strategic goals and objectives that really strive to infuse accessibility into the core of what we do. So this is more proactive. And so we'll also be sharing a little bit more about what this has looked like and where we're really hoping to go in this space as well. And so really getting started in my efforts to understand, the positioning of where we can have the biggest impact, I first needed to understand a little bit more about our community itself. Who shares the roles and responsibilities in supporting, the success of the academic mission and the co-op process? This really includes, making efforts to gain awareness of and appreciate the different resources and supports that are available to students, really navigating the co-op employment experience and how this intersects with co-op across campus. So where can students go if they need support with resume and cover letter? What does that look like from a disability lens? Or where can students go if they need support with managing anxiety for interviews? So seeing how there's amazing work already being done on campus and some of the experts that are leading that work. So this occurs a lot through kind of environmental scanning, understanding where those contact points are. It really helps us to acquire knowledge and be experts and resource liaisons across the university, which is quite vast and really an important role, and really helps to build relationships. It also includes the efforts made to kind of collect input and feedback from our community itself on barriers, knowledge gaps, and accessibility requirements. And this might occur through consultations, utilizing the research and data on best practice. And I do have to say how amazing it is that we have our own research consultative branch in the Work Learn Institute that is able to do such great work so close to home, right? So regardless of that, it's still very important to be able to say, how are we connecting with those most present in this space? At the University of Waterloo, we also have what is called the Co-op Student Experience Survey, which is administered to all students on recruitment terms or work terms that allows us to kind of understand a little bit of trends on satisfaction and barriers that they might be experiencing. And so this element, of course, really focuses on centering those voices to help us also then identify barriers through kind of those information and service gaps. And so I want to share a little bit of an example of how we utilize this feedback and went through that process to actually create a new resource, specifically in the world of kind of employment accommodation supports. And so this was really responding to a gap between in that student kind of transitional support between school and work environments. And so we never really had a dedicated resource on supporting co-op students with requesting employment accommodations. The previous pathway that we had relied on students accessing this kind of support by registering with the university's centralized office for supporting academic accommodations, accessibility services, or AAS. So and when we looked at that, I could go on and on all day about how amazing that accessibility services is and the benefits that come from registering. But when we look at it from a perspective of meeting the unique needs of co-op, we thought there was maybe something else we could do, and we noticed some limitations. First, in the scope of practice. So the scope of practice, unsurprisingly for the academic accommodations office, is in academics. The documentation that we collect would often speak to functional limitations that pertain to an academic experience. And so the ability to extrapolate that to employment is a little bit more limited. And I say that because I used to do these appointments. So I used to be able to work with students and say, these are some things that we might be able to suggest. I can really speak to what your academic accommodations are. So there's always a bit of a scope limitation there. And next, the other limitation was a little bit more in kind of logistics and resources. We know that registering with accessibility services and onboarding does take a little bit of time. And so when we look at how that might be a challenge for co-op and often the unique and temporal needs of co-op, we know that interviews may be scheduled, in a few days' notice, or work terms might be arranged, partway through a term. And so that turnaround and that the necessary aspect of having kind of timely support also was a bit constrained with the previous model that we had in place. Thank you. And so the approach we took really acknowledged the impact of really decoupling the process of obtaining academic accommodations and then receiving support with requesting employment accommodations for co-op students. And essentially what we did is we created a new pathway for students, the Co-op Accommodations Support Pathway, or CASP, which allowed students to really connect directly with me to receive support in enabling their ability to participate in the employment accommodation process. So that's important because this process does not bypass the accommodation process with the employer. It does not also bypass our procedural and substantive duty to accommodate and what that looks like. But I'm really trying to help students satisfy their roles and responsibilities in the employment accommodation process. And so because of that, I don't collect medical documentation. They don't need to register with me in any way. I'm really trying to position myself as an optional resource to meet students where they are at, providing coaching, support, education, strategizing on what communicating with your employer might look like, how we can try to translate academic accommodations to the employment world just based on some of my experiences there. And so I still can't go to the point of determining what the employment accommodations will be. But again, I'm really trying to help them be able to participate in that process. And so what we've been finding is I've been able to do that in a much timelier way. It's more accessible in terms of meeting the needs of what they're looking at that time. And it also limits kind of unnecessary disclosure. So they don't have to register with the academic accommodation office if they need support for employment accommodations only. They have a little bit more of a pathway that really values that self-determination of the students. And so that's really what we've been finding with that pathway so far. And so while the previous example was really focused on creating more accessible accommodation pathways, as we talked about as one area of my role, I do think, and we know that accessibility is more than accommodations, it is a mindset. And so I do believe that naturally our thinking should continue to expand to figuring out how we can reduce our reliance on accommodations to make things accessible and focus more on how can we make things accessible in the first place. And so what we're really kind of calling this a little bit is how we can try to infuse an accessibility mindset. And this is really referring to how we are embedding accessibility into how we think and do co-op. It's not co-op and then accessibility over here. It needs to be considered as an integral part of that program experience, the same way that we would not overlook something like a budget when we're developing a new resource or an event. And so how are we trying to get there? Well, we are really striving for this to be a result of building our disability confidence through engagement in purposeful learning activities, allowing our stakeholders and our students and staff and employers to help kind of co-create the goals that are most important for them. And so this is really that purposeful way that we're trying to connect our emphasis on professional development to the intersection of this with our work. And we really want it to seep into every facet of co-op by empowering the people that are responsible for it. And so consequently, if we can really build the confidence of everyone that is responsible for co-op, this also allows us to create more opportunities to enhance accessibility across the entire co-op experience, including those areas where we really share responsibility with our employers and our students. And I wanted to share a little bit of an example of what that might look like. And so when we look back at some of the tips that Anne shared on behalf of the Work Learn Institute, and so we will look today a little bit around, what does inclusive job postings and interviews look like? We then, as a post-secondary institution, need to make sure that we can turn around and then make sure our service model and our platform, so Waterloo Works, are really allies in this. So when we're looking at how our employer module really guides employers through the job posting process, interview scheduling, rank and match, all that stuff, does it do enough to realize some of these tips or enable it? How does Waterloo Works really tease out essential requirements when employers are putting in their job descriptions or mentioning accommodation policies in the descriptions? How can we really, utilize search strategies by utilizing accessibility job tags or clusters that can really help streamline that search process for students who are valuing that in their job search? How can also, the interview request messaging that goes out through Waterloo Works, how can that maybe pull information about the interview details, what to expect, giving everyone, not just students with disabilities, but giving them a little bit more informed information so that they can then decide, well, do I need to disclose? Do I need an accommodation? Have them a little bit more informed about what to expect. So how can we really be allies in this? But also, how can we ensure that our employer and student consults by default include bringing up the topics of accessibility and accommodations, making sure that we are really reiterating this, bringing it to the forefront, and highlighting its importance to the success of the student employment experience, the same way that we would ask about anything else around an e-check-in or a console, right? So elevating accessibility to the same standards. And so those are just a couple of examples of what, infusing that accessibility mindset might look like. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the larger implications that come from us with trying to infuse that accessibility mindset, including its ability to really challenge those conventional models of understanding, what is meant by academic and employment success or disability support models. And so when we use a lens of accessibility or disability inclusion, we start to become a little bit more aware and sometimes critical of how our educational and employment systems are designed and accessed and where we can make improvements. And I think a great example of this is really being seen through the current efforts through the post-secondary education standards under the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, AODA. So really what they are working on is they have developed basically 185 recommendations for improving accessibility and inclusion at the post-secondary level, with the goal of having this put into law the same way that we have, AODA employment standards or information and communication standards or transportation standards that govern accessibility for service providers, including post-secondary institutions. So they're working on, the K-12 version. There's a healthcare one, but they're also looking at post-secondary. And I think the standards really acknowledge significance in rethinking not just how the accommodation process works, but how we're really assessing our understanding of what does access to post-secondary education look like? What does learning look like for everyone? What's that model for understanding what success looks like, beyond grades or those scholastic achievements, which is tough because we know that's such an embedded and systemic system. That's what we're used to, what we're familiar with. And so addressing this is going to take a big culture shift. It's going to take a big commitment to resources. And I think this is also another way that post-secondary institutions can really endorse this and leverage this work a little bit as well. And so I am, proud to acknowledge that the University of Waterloo's stance on these. Again, these are just at the recommendations level at this point, but we are really trying to treat these as a call to action from the disability community, and really looking at how we can try to utilize and steer into a little bit of that innovative thinking. And when we think about, the difficult financial times that are happening right now with the universities, this is a perfect time to be able to lean into that innovative thinking to help us develop new solutions, think differently for how we can come out of this stronger and better on the other end of this. And so I think this is kind of the last thing that I want to share today. And this is a big change that I'm really excited about in our roles as post-secondary institutions. And, we talk a lot about, future-proofing here at the University of Waterloo, future-proofing ourselves, future-proofing our employers and our students, which I love. It's an incredible concept. And, I've said this before, but what better way to do that than by designing with inclusivity in mind? Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mitch and Carolina. We have one question that came in through the Q&A, and then we received a number of questions in advance. So I'm going to start with the question that we have, and I'm sure others will come in. As usual, we don't have too much time, so let's dive right in. Carolina, I think this is for you. It came in during your presentation. As part of your broader employee awareness training, do you ask for feedback where employees can express concerns about any possible upcoming changes?
That's a really good question. We do ask for feedback when we develop new programs or processes. As often as possible, we consult with our employee resource groups, and we try to run by them everything we produce to see what impact it will have. And I would always recommend it as a standard practice and doing it consistently. I mentioned earlier, if we try to benefit certain groups or have typically positive impact on our workforce, doing it without talking to them makes no sense. But of course, there are some situations where decisions are made and not consulted with employees, and I don't think it's possible to avoid for most organizations.
Great, thank you so much. Mitch, I'm going to come to you with the next question, and it is a multi-part question. So let's go through just piece by piece, okay? The first question is, can you provide some examples of the types of accommodations that students could get?
Yeah, okay. So I think I'll start by prefacing, I think this really depends on that unique intersection between, the employee, the individual, and how that intersects with the roles and responsibilities, the environment, not just the physical environment, the social emotional environment. So it's a bit of a holistic intersection of a few different things. So it's hard to say exactly what that would look like. Of course, I get the understanding of the question, but I always want to preface as saying this is always going to be a unique assessment of that context. The vast majority of the time, I think it's ultimately looking at kind of the idea of exploring some flexibility with the nature of the work itself. And so whether that's looking at what kind of adjustments might be needed to the workstation itself, what does that mean for the way in which someone takes in, processes information as well? So do they need different formats of materials, not just verbal communication in meetings? Maybe they need written information to kind of support that processing and retention of that as well. It also could look like changes to the scheduling of hours of work, the flexibility with that, location. We're very much in a world of a hybrid has become a little bit more normal. So really understanding what is possible for them to do those essential requirements. What does it look like for breaks? Do they need breaks scattered throughout the day to really support functional limitations that might speak to kind of tolerance or attention and what that looks like as well. I've also seen one where sometimes more frequent check-ins can even be almost considered a bit of an accommodation, but also a strategy as well.
Great, thank you. Did you have anything you wanted to add on that, Carolina? No.
I think it's a great answer.
Great, thank you. Well, we're getting some questions in as we were talking, so I'm going to turn to a few that we got live. I'll send this to both of you, and you can decide if either one of you wants to take it. Students ask what types of documentation will they need to request an accommodation in the workplace. Any examples? So perhaps would you be able to speak to what you do at Kinaxis, Carolina?
Most organizations have a form to fill in where they ask questions about what the limitations are and what accommodations are needed. Typically, organizations don't ask about the diagnosis. It's not legal. So I would hope most organizations wouldn't ask about that. A lot of organizations would also ask for a doctor's note, which confirms that student has a disability and what kind of limitations that disability causes in relation to the job requirements. But again, it would not involve disclosing a disability. I think this is the most typical practice, but as Mitch mentioned before, asking for the doctor's note is or can be a barrier itself because a lot of people don't have family doctors, don't have a diagnosis. Sometimes it costs a lot of money to get a diagnosis, and they are not able to provide the doctor's note in a timely manner.
Great. Thank you so much, Carolina. I have another question for you that came in advance. So If diversity is the strongest argument for expanded accommodations in the workplace, how can HR frame this as an asset and not a liability for senior leadership?
It's a great question. And I think in the context of accessibility, it's not really a choice if we hire people with disabilities or not. 1 in 7 people in the world experience disability. And that's a lot. So I think it's safe to assume that we already hire a lot of people with disabilities, and we also serve customers with disabilities, whether we provide products or services. I think all employers want their employees to be as productive as possible and as engaged. And no one wants to pay an employee a salary, but only have them perform at 80% of what their skills and abilities actually are. So investing in accessibility really makes so much sense because we do already employ people with disabilities. A lot of disabilities are not visible. And sometimes people don't know that they have a disability, especially when it comes to neurodivergence. A lot of people have lived a very long life without ever getting a diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, your top performers may be living without a disability today, but it may change tomorrow. And it can be permanent, it can be short-term, but most of us at some point in our life experience some sort of disability. So having all of those best practices in place really helps mitigate all kinds of performance issues, not only for people with disabilities, but also all employees. Because when you actually start learning about those best practices or even legal requirements, you will start seeing that they actually benefit everyone, not just employees with disabilities. So it's just really good practice and common sense to invest in it, to prevent performance issues and really get out of your employees as much as possible. And I would say it's impossible to avoid hiring people with disabilities. So you are dealing with this whether you want it or not, trying to hire people with disabilities or not.
Thank you so much, Carolina. I've got my eye on the time, and these hours always fly by. So I want to say a huge thank you to everyone for joining us once again. There was a question about sending out slides. Yes, we will send out the slides afterwards in a follow-up message. And I think our colleagues just put in the Stay Connected. We've got lots more great Future Ready Workforce series webinars coming your way in the near future. So please do stay connected to us. And thank you so much, everyone, for your time and your attention and your contributions today.